Hello and good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight at our special People's Assembly event. It's special every single Thursday, but tonight we are announcing, we're launching, we're talking about our COVID zero strategy that has recently been adopted by the People's Assembly. What a week it has been. The suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, the intense political polarization in the United States of America, and of course, lockdown 2.0 here. So we're back to another lockdown because of the utter failure of this government. And of course, we'll be analysing that tonight, but we'll be talking about what is the alternative? How could things be different? How are things different in other countries that have taken a completely different approach? As always, please share the live feed, like the People's Assembly page. If you share this live feed, then you will be letting other people see this who might not know that this set of ideas exists. Please tag friends in if you're having some of those difficult conversations and really disagree with each other, to make sure they can see this too. But tonight we are discussing the very important issue of zero COVID. So that's the elimination of the virus from the United Kingdom, the complete total suppression of it. We are of course such a long way away from that. We are in a lockdown and release cycle, but with the government settling or deciding that they will allow for a certain level of the virus to be present. And the difficulty that I'm sure everybody's going to kind of explain with that strategy tonight is that whilst it is present, there is still a threat to human life, and we do not find that acceptable, as well as all of the other harms that will be discussed tonight. The People's Assembly have very recently adopted a zero COVID position. I'm pleased to say, and our first speaker is going to be talking about that position. Let me just run through who our speakers are. We've got John Rees, we've got Richard Bergen, Corinne Pearson, we've got Gawain Little and Diane Abbott from all different kind of sectors and walks of life, who are going to talk to us about why they support a zero COVID position. And also, I think fundamentally what I'd like us to think about tonight, because I know there are so many activists that watch this every Thursday, is how are we part of the closing of the gap from where we are now to where we want to be? So how does our activism contribute to that? That's really the kind of central question for a movement like the People's Assembly. So I am going to come to you first, John Rees. You're a co-founder of the People's Assembly, and recently you presented to the committee the idea of zero COVID, which was obviously warmly received. I'd like you to talk to us about why the People's Assembly have adopted that position and why you think this is the political position that we need to move towards in the United Kingdom. Over to you.
Thanks, Laura. Yes, and I think it is obviously an important moment. I mean, you've only got to look at the figures that we're now seeing about the COVID pandemic to realise that the rate of infections is now substantially greater, more than double the figure at the height of the lockdown last time round back in March and April. And of course, the government tell you that that's because people are doing more testing. And I guess we know that the rate is higher then, but that doesn't actually alter the situation. Those cases exist, those people are infected. And as we now see, as night follows day, the number of deaths are increasing as well. We went through a period where it was down towards the tens, but now it's crept back up to the autumn into the hundreds, and now standing just below 500 deaths in a single day yesterday. And that obviously is the only thing that's got the government to even think about doing a second lockdown. And the second lockdown, I must say, looks to me as if it's going to be a very weak and half-hearted affair indeed. And I doubt very much if it will be as effective as the first lockdown, unless they're forced to tighten it, which they may well be forced to do by the increasing number of deaths and the pressure on the NHS. And in many ways, that's the motivation for a zero COVID policy, because we should never be in this situation. It should never have been the case that we arrived back at the need for a second lockdown. There should have been an adequate test and trace system which would have given us an alternative, but we don't have that. That's a massive failure on the government's part. It's a failure of imagination, it's a failure of execution, It's a failure of privatization. It's one of the worst and most egregious examples of something that's supposed to be the NHS. I mean, that's what you get on your phone. That's what it says, the NHS app, but is actually the private company Serco involved in that failure. So we don't have that alternative. Neither do we yet, of course, have a vaccine, which would be the beginnings of an alternative as well. And so because the government has so completely failed to deal effectively with the first wave, released us from the lockdown too quickly, promoted schemes like the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which we now know is responsible for a fifth, 20% of new COVID infections, hasn't really dealt with the question of schools and colleges as super spreaders of the disease. Because of that catastrophic failure, we now have to, I think, insist on imagining a different way forward. And it can't be to constantly trade off the economy and jobs against health and survival. That can't be an acceptable way to deal with that. That's the whole, kind of approach that the government is taking. That's what the 50 Tory MPs who couldn't bring themselves to vote for this lockdown are arguing, that people just have to get on with their lives, rather ignoring the fact that some people are going to be losing their lives from that policy. We just have to carry on. It's back to the old discredited herd immunity strategy and suck it up, because that's what the economy needs. Now, we just can't go on like that. We can't go on with a situation where people are asked to choose between saving their job or saving their granny. That's not a remotely acceptable choice to give people. So a zero COVID strategy is about saying this: the resources are there in this society to both protect people's jobs and their livelihoods and to deal effectively with this pandemic. The amount of money that Rishi Sunak spent on the furlough scheme is 1/3 the money that was spent bailing out the banks back during the banking crash. So imagine what we could already be doing in terms of sustaining people's livelihood if we had that kind of money there. It's there. Borrowing at the moment is essentially free. There's zero interest rates. The government doesn't have that hanging over it. What it lacks is the will to protect ordinary people, to protect their health and to protect their jobs and livelihoods. And if we don't adopt this strategy, we'll always end up prey to trading off one section of the community against another, that the old and vulnerable have to isolate while everybody else goes to work, that we can't be protecting people in care homes, that we can't be protecting ethnic minorities or people who are in frontline jobs. We'll always be playing that game unless we insist that there is the resources and there is the possibility of both having an effective lockdown to break the pandemic, to bring forward a test and trace system, to work toward a vaccine, protecting people's health, and at the same time to ensure that they don't suffer economically. That's what the zero COVID strategy is about, as far as I'm concerned.
And so desperately needed, is it? John, thank you so much for that explanation about where we are and where we need to be, and some of the failures of this government. I think what I'm hearing from people who we're all living through this together is that there is a real tiredness about living through this pandemic now. There's a real point to which people are saying we just want to kind of come out of the other side, whatever that is. And I think there mustn't be in the movement an acceptance, well, that is, we just capitulate to the government strategy because we are all so tired. Actually, I think it should be the opposite of that. We must ramp up our activism efforts to say to the government, we're not just going to accept this strategy, because as John very eloquently pointed out, that it might be pitting people against each other, but we also know those who are able to shield themselves from the virus are the wealthiest people in society. That there has never been a lockdown for the poorest paid people in the United Kingdom. I'm coming next to Richard Bergen, MP. It is very, very nice to have you at a People's Assembly meeting tonight, not least about this issue. I know you have every single day been talking about the failures of the government strategy. You are also in the Socialist campaign group of MPs talking about a zero COVID position. I just want to hear why, and I suppose what you think we can do to kind of influence the political system to get us to a new position. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Laura. And I want to thank as well the People's Assembly for organising this meeting on zero COVID, but also thank them for the work that the group has done, the organisation has done over the past decade, fighting for a fairer country. That vision for an economy that serves the people will be vital over the coming months as the ruling elites push for this crisis to be paid on the back of working people. And before I get on to COVID, I just want to also say well done for all the People's Assembly Against Austerity is doing to help get Jeremy Corbyn reinstated to the Labour Party. I want to start off with one key fact about coronavirus. When right-wing politicians and journalists say we can't do anything to stop coronavirus, as they've been telling me, show them these figures. South Korea has had 9 COVID deaths per million people. New Zealand has had 5 COVID deaths per million people. China, 3. Thailand, 1. In Vietnam, less than 1 death per million people. So what about Britain? Britain has had 688 deaths per million people. Had we kept deaths as low as the countries I've just mentioned, we'd have deaths in their hundreds. Instead, we have deaths over 60,000. This is literally a matter of life or death. Today, people have gone back into lockdown, and this was necessary. But we should be clear, lockdowns are a sign of government failure, a failure to get this disease under control. And lockdowns aren't a solution in and of themselves. We can't keep going in and out of a cycle of lockdowns because that will cost too many lives and cost too many livelihoods. So the government really needs to use this lockdown to reset its strategy. We can't get to December and then go back to what we were doing before. The virus will simply take off again. That's why we need a new strategy. It's also why the government has to lock down properly, not use half measures. A proper lockdown means shutting schools and shutting universities, as the scientists have called for and as the evidence shows is necessary. If we don't do that, we'll end up either needing a longer lockdown or more likely this lockdown will fail. So I fully support the NEU and the UCU in their campaigning on that. We also need to use this lockdown to boot out the private companies ruining our test and trace system. How dare the Prime Minister talk of the failings of NHS test and trace as he did at Prime Minister's questions yesterday. The Tories have wasted billions of pounds handing money over to Serco and the like. They shouldn't get a penny more. The money should go to the National Health Service and Dale Harding should be sacked. So that's a couple of important things that need to happen during lockdown, but we should also need a fundamental change in strategy. Why should that strategy be zero COVID? Well, in the last 2 weeks, the UK has had 300,000 cases. It's totally different in East Asia, where zero COVID is being followed. Vietnam, with more people than the UK, has had just 62 cases. Thailand, with the same number of people as the UK, has had 91 cases. China, with many, many times more people than the UK, has had 395 cases. If we scale up New Zealand to the size of the UK, it's had 800 cases. The UK has had 300,000, as I say. This isn't to do with weather or whatever the right wing say to deny the UK has a problem. It's because East Asian countries there, they've learnt from their experience with the 2003 SARS virus, and they've put in place proper public health practices to try to eliminate COVID. We can do that too, and it's frankly reckless that our government hasn't. So what would a zero COVID strategy look like? Well, firstly, it looks like hope. People need to know that the situation can be turned around and won't go on forever. It would look like a huge step towards normality. Have people seen, for example, the recent pictures that I saw of rugby stadiums packed full in New Zealand, or of packed nightclubs and water parks in Wuhan, where the virus originated? We can have that too, and have it safely with the right strategy. It would look like a return to a more normal economy. Zero COVID wouldn't falsely counterpose saving lives with saving the economy. It would protect both by driving down the virus to very low levels as the basis for kickstarting the economy. So in terms of the precise policies that we need to fight for, it's important to understand that key to zero COVID is, of course, test, trace, and isolate, but most importantly, support. Instead of locking down countries, we lock down cases. That means getting cases low through this lockdown. And once low enough, we can use the test and trace to find and isolate. So sorting out test and trace is vital. I think there's a problem with my video there as it started again.
You're back on. Yeah, you're back on.
Don't know what happened there. So sorting out the test and trace is vital, but it isn't enough. For people to actually isolate, there needs to be a real support package. That would include sick pay at real living wage levels. And I've gone off again, but I'll just continue. It would involve offering free hotel rooms, as South Korea has done, to people who can't isolate as they live in cramped houses. It would involve sick pay at real living wage levels for those needing to self-isolate. It may mean help on getting food and the basics in, extra help to those with caring responsibilities, or even psychological support to those struggling with self-isolation. It would mean ensuring that there is proper financial support, including for those on 0 hours contracts, and ensuring nobody on furlough is living below the minimum wage, as it was confirmed this week that millions of people, in fact, are. In schools, it would mean ensuring there is proper support, creating smaller class sizes, by hiring community spaces and recruiting qualified teachers, as well as proper broadband home support, which is vitally important. And maybe if I had better broadband, the camera wouldn't keep going off. In universities, teaching would move largely online, and fees would be scrapped in recognition of that. In short, zero COVID is a progressive solution to this crisis, and only progressives will fight for it. And of course, this is all predicated on getting the virus low enough to be able to do all of this and track the cases. But in the summer, we were nearly there. Before this reckless government told people to go out and spend, get back to work, go to school, etc. Before this government told people it was their patriotic duty to go to the pub, we were nearly there. So let's fight to get there again, but this time with the correct strategy in place. And finally, if we don't have the answers on this enormous question, then others will step into the vacuum. Without a clear alternative, it is perfectly possible that people will feel that nothing whatsoever more can be done. That's what Nigel Farage is hoping with his new Reform Party, which seems to want to go for herd immunity. So once again, big congratulations to the People's Assembly Against Austerity for organising this meeting, and let's all of us push the call for zero COVID through all of our communities.
Richard, thank you so much. I hadn't heard of Nigel Farage's new party, so there's a downer there, but of course he'll kind of reinvent himself. And I think you're right to say the alternative to this fatigue, the alternative to this tiredness about the virus and people, this desperation to get back to some form of normality is a COVID, zero COVID strategy. Did you hear what Richard Bergen had to say there? You know, everybody watching at home, when you know people come back with arguments like, well, they're just doing their best about the government, they're just trying hard, you know, who has ever handled a pandemic before, you know, in our living memory, they're just trying their best. Listen to the difference in the figures because of the difference in political strategies. It is stark. And I think this idea that it can't be different needs to be taken on every single place that we can. Richard told us 300,000 new cases for us in Vietnam, 62, Thailand, 91. I mean, it pales in comparison to what we are having to endure here. And the impact, the cumulative impact is huge. And one of the most agonizing decisions that needs to be made by those who are living through this is sending their children to school or not, having to go in and teach or not. It is one of, as we know, the places that the virus is able to spread because of the sheer volumes of people that are in schools. This morning I had the pleasure to take part in Corbyn Pearson and her group, the Boycott the Unsafe Return to Schools Parents United meeting, because I know thousands of parents were taking part in a school strike today for all sorts of reasons that I'm going to ask you about now, because this is not about blaming teachers, not about blaming support staff. This is the full onus on the government for really putting many parents and carers and people who are supporting young people in the most difficult position. So let's hear from you now, Corbyn Pearson. Thanks so much, Richard Bergen. Let's hear from Corbyn Pearson now from Parents United, Boycott the Unsafe Return to Schools.
Hi, thank you for having me here this evening, and yeah, thank you for attending our meeting this morning, Laura, that helped kick off our parent strike. I just want to say something before I kind of get going talking about the parent strike and Brutus Parents United, that schools, the cases of COVID-19 are the most prevalent in schools, second only to care homes. And that's really important, because when the government are continuously pushing the narrative and the rhetoric that schools are COVID safe, it is absolutely laughable. So I just want to talk a little bit about the campaign and kind of our day of action today. Our campaign, Brutus Parents United, is centred around choice. Parents being able to be afforded the luxury of choice as to whether we find it safe or not for our children to be able to go to school, whether it's safe for our families for our children to be able to go to school, or ourselves if we are indeed school staff or teachers too. But the government have continuously ignored us and denied us that luxury of choice, and instead they have given us bully boy tactics instead. What we've got now is a government that are now fining parents, and this is happening. We've got parents who are being taken to court with criminal charges for not sending their children into school. They are being fined, or they are having pressure put on them to deregister their children from school, which means that they are losing their child's right to a school place. And today's parent strike was about sending the government a message that we, as parents, are not going to stand for this. We are not going to throw our children and our vulnerable family members under the bus. And today's parent strike saw thousands and thousands of parents voting with their feet and withdrawing their children from school for one day. And as part of that, we had a huge social media campaign in which we used the hashtag parent strike. So if you want to go and look that up, I'd suggest that you do. And we had lots of parents posting pictures of their children's empty school shoes saying no to school today. We know that the government behind the scenes are making some really, really sneaky and nasty choices about who is and who isn't vulnerable. And only today they've said, you know, the guidance about clinically extremely vulnerable children has changed. And they said that clinically extremely vulnerable children don't have to go to school. But the list of those conditions in which makes you clinically extremely vulnerable has been drastically reduced. And not only that, Now, this time round in lockdown 2.0, as you put it, Laura, you now have to have written evidence from a GP to say that your child is clinically extremely vulnerable. And there's two issues there. It's incredibly difficult to get into a GP and get some written evidence to say that your child is clinically extremely vulnerable. And secondly, there's no risk assessment around an entire family. So a child might be going to school who is not clinically extremely vulnerable, but going home to a family where there might be a family member who is in that category, or a family member who is elderly, and that puts them more at risk. You know, children don't operate in isolation. We don't live in, you know, world of Lord of the Flies here. You know, children are associated and linked with adults, and those people need to be factored in too. You know, what we could have seen here, and you're absolutely right, Richard, and you were right too, John, is that this crisis could have brought about an overhaul of everything that was wrong. And this crisis could have brought about an overhaul in our education system. But instead, the government have systematically failed to respond, failed to act, and refused to do anything about it. And instead, we've gone back to the status quo, which wasn't good enough prior to the pandemic, and it certainly isn't good enough now. They've stripped away the kind of good bits about education, and we're left with this kind of, for all the kind of heroic efforts of our fantastic school staff across the country, we are now in a situation where we have a Victorian style education system where children are sitting in cold classrooms, where we've got an absolute chronic underfunding of the education system. And if you don't fit into that education system, well, then that's your tough luck. We've got lack of resources, we've got lack of teachers because they're off, because they're self-isolating. And I think what Richard said was really important. Nobody wants this second lockdown. This second lockdown was not inevitable, and nobody gets some kind of like perverse pleasure out of knowing that we're in a second lockdown or that we're hoiking our kids out of school. But this has happened because the government have failed to act time and time and time again, and we're back here again. And if they continue to ignore the situation in schools, this lockdown is going to be long, and it's going to be damaging, and it's going to be an exercise in futility. And they have to address what's going on in schools and the transmission rate in schools. And what we need to see now is comprehensively funded and resourced blended and remote learning. And that includes internet access for all children. It includes laptops for all of the children that need it. It includes free school meals for kids who need them. It includes reduced class sizes. We have some of the largest class sizes in Europe, and that wasn't good enough prior to the pandemic, and it's certainly not good enough now. It means that we don't have any social distancing. We need protection for our staff, for our students, our whole families and communities, and we need some honesty and transparency. We know that schools are having pressure put on them to hide cases of COVID-19, to only send home the bare minimum of students, and that's coming from central government. And what we need as parents is honesty and transparency.
Very, very, very well put, Corin from Parents United. Honestly, thank you for everything that your campaign is doing. I think it is actually an act of solidarity with those teachers, teaching assistants, all the support staff, and those who are the most vulnerable in society. This isn't about, you know, your group against what the National Education Union are doing, as we'll hear about in just a second. And actually, we talked about this morning, didn't we, at your brilliant meeting. One of the really difficult things in all of this is how this pandemic entrenches inequalities, how your employment relationship, your socioeconomic status, so how much money you have in the bank, what you are entitled to if you have to self-isolate, protects you or not from the virus. And I suppose the ability to have your children at home is not going to be an ability that every single person has, and this is about building a collective system that allows all of those children to be safe, all of those parents to be safe, and all of those who are working in the education to be safe. So solidarity, you and everything that your group does. If you've got any questions out there for Corin's group or how to get involved, keep watching. She can answer them in just a few minutes after our next two contributors. And there are hundreds of people watching this, by the way, which is brilliant. The faithful here every single Thursday night. But if you haven't shared this by now, it's all we ask of you. Share this live feed, get this to the most amount of people that we possibly can. Gawain Little, you are from the National Education Union. So we are firstly very pleased that you have been able to come here. And I imagine there are intense conversations behind the scenes about what is a precarious situation, let's be honest, in schools. I live near schools and I see the volumes of people en masse coming to these central points and think this cannot be right in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a lockdown. Let's hear what you've got to say, Gawain. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura, and thanks to the People's Assembly for putting this meeting together. I also want to thank Corbyn for all the work that she and others are doing to help try and keep our young people and our schools and colleges safe. Over the past few weeks, we've seen, I think, the disdain with which this government treats working class families and communities. We've seen the failure to support COVID measures in the north of England with adequate finance. We've seen the failure to feed our children through the holidays. And we've seen the failure to include schools and colleges in what is supposed to be a national lockdown. Now, let's be clear. This isn't just about schools and colleges, those who work in them, those who learn in them. It's about their families. It's about their communities. And it's about our entire society. That's because schools and colleges have become an engine driving the spread of this virus. COVID rates, as of last week, were 50 times higher amongst the secondary school and college population than they were in September. Secondary school students are the second most infected of all the age groups, with 2% of the school population estimated to be infected now with COVID nationally, far higher in some areas. In primary schools, the equivalent figure is 1%. Now, with figures like that, a lockdown which doesn't include schools and colleges is simply not a lockdown. We need to include schools and colleges in order to make this lockdown have any impact on the rate in any reasonable time frame. But we also need to be looking at rotas in schools when we come back, to be looking at blended learning, as Corbyn had said. And that means proper investment in the IT that our students need to be able to access that, in broadband. It means proper investment in schools to be able to provide that blended learning. And it means supporting parents who will need to take time off work because they have no protection when schools are closed. If they're in a 0 hours contract job or precarious employment, when those schools are closed down for all but those most at risk and the children of key workers, what happens to those parents? There needs to be support for them. But that doesn't mean leaving schools and colleges open, spreading this virus. We need protections for clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable workers to work from home. Government guidance saying work at home wherever possible and go on to sick pay if not is not enough. We need proper support for all of those clinically vulnerable and other at-risk groups. But ultimately, in the education system, we need the investment in Nightingale schools, like they talked about Nightingale hospitals, Nightingale schools, and a massive expansion of the education workforce to allow proper social distancing in schools and colleges through reduced class sizes. That's the only way we'll get proper social distancing in our schools and colleges. And of course, we need an effective test, track and trace system, including asymptomatic testing, because we need to defeat this virus. We need to have a COVID-0 strategy. Now, if the government won't step up, we need to fight for this in our workplaces and in our communities, because I believe there comes a point when a government won't act in the interests of those that elected it, that we need to make them act or make them get out of the way. The fact is, we will keep our schools and colleges and communities safe, regardless of what this government does. Now, to this end, the National Education Union this week has launched an app called NEU Escalation, which supports our workplace reps, our school and college union groups to work collectively to make their workplaces safe. It talks them through the process of getting together, a meeting of all union members, of all their colleagues, of discussing how we organise around the issues and how we change the facts on the ground. Now, that's what we're doing in our workplaces, and we've already had thousands and thousands of reps and workplace groups access this app, use it to start making their workplaces safer. But I believe we need to act in the same way in our communities. We need to bring our communities together to discuss the COVID Zero Charter that the People's Assembly has released, to discuss the strategy for winning that, to discuss how we put pressure on this government, because ultimately we need to come together to build the change that our communities and our society needs.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. And remember those claps for key workers when we were like out on our doorsteps? I was bashing a pan and a colander out on my doorstep. Well, the next phase of that, I don't know if you know, is that we unequivocally support the industrial demands of all of those key workers too. So it's just a continuation of the claps for key workers. So we are in solidarity with the National Education Union and very much support your position and wish you luck in keeping schools as safe as possible. But of course, we know that a proper lockdown would need to include schools. I'm just going to read out some of the comments. People are asking where they can get reliable information on some of this stuff. I think that's such an important question, and we are going to in just a second hear from Diane Abbott, and she is working closely with Independent Sage. They have a press conference I think I'm right when I say this, every Friday at 1:30, and they broadcast it live. Like, they are scientists. They're just a different set of scientists who are advising government. So you can watch that. That would be a really good place to start. And they have loads of publications on their website too about the virus. So that's Indie Sage, Independent Sage. Richard, I'm just going to come back to you before. I know you might need to leave us for another appointment, and then we're going to hear from Diane. But somebody said that in the chat, people are saying, "Oh, it's disgusting to see left-wing people advocating a lockdown," and they're asking, "What do you say to that?" I mean, I'm not sure why it's a contradiction that left-wing people might be advocating that we preserve health above anything else, but what would you say to that?
Well, it's a left-wing position to use the power of the state in the interests of the many and in the interests of the vulnerable, and to take coordinated state action to get the virus under control and allow people to return to their lives as normal as possible. Obviously, we all see these strange conspiracy theories doing the rounds on the internet from a minority of people, as if the elite needs a lockdown to run the show. The establishment runs a show already. What we're talking about is acting in the interest of people's health, but also acting in the interest of returning to something approaching normality as soon as possible. And actually, it's a left-wing position we've got, because who are the people advocating herd immunity? Who are the people advocating let the virus rip? It's the right-wing free market ideologues who believe in a survival of the fittest approach. We believe in something better than a survival of the fittest approach. We believe in caring for everybody. We believe in looking after everybody. We believe in using the power of the state to protect lives, protect people's living standards, and move forward to a better future. And a zero COVID strategy is part of that.
Thank you so much for that answer, Richard. And I think it is difficult, isn't it, when you think about those sentiments about letting it rip, when we know that 6 in 10 people who have died from the virus are disabled people. And actually, that's not, when people are talking about, people with underlying health conditions or disabled people or those who are over 65, these are people in our families, who might still have to go out to work. These are our loved ones. And so we need to defend our own communities, and to the disproportionate nature that the virus has had on Black communities is absolutely staggering. So let's not have any of this, well, we just let it rip, because we know it isn't affecting the wealthiest in society. We know it is only entrenching those inequalities. I'm so pleased to get to our final speaker of tonight. It is Diane Abbott. She is an amazing parliamentarian. I've had the pleasure to serve alongside her, usually sit behind her as she was about to take to the dispatch box, and watch her in awe, really, in meetings, sometimes behind the scenes too. Diane, it's so great to have you here tonight. You are pulling together independent SAGE and people who are, I suppose, advocating a different course of action. This is very important work, and we would love to hear about it.
Thank you very much, Laura. Can you hear me? Very good. I just want to talk about why Britain needs a zero COVID strategy. And it's worth reminding people that this is the worst health crisis that any of us have seen in our lifetimes. It's sweeping through populations around the world. But I think it's striking that in neoliberal societies like Boris Johnson's Britain and Trump's America, it's neoliberal societies have been hit the hardest. And in those societies, the poor and Black and ethnic minority people have been hit harder than anybody. And it's happening alongside an economic crisis, which is connected with the coronavirus crisis. So we're seeing job losses, business closures, government revenue slashed, the inevitable cuts in the public sector, and the Tories have made it clear, if you concentrate on what they're saying, that in the end, working people will have to pay the cost of the current business support measures through renewed austerity. And one of the reasons why we need any strategy, actually, is the government's record has been catastrophic. You cannot say too often that Britain has the highest death rate in Europe. Approaching 50,000 people have died. We know, those of you that will follow what happened last weekend and the press conference that was postponed, I think at least 3 times, that Boris Johnson doesn't know what he's doing from 1 hour to the next. We know after the whole Dominic Cummings fiasco that there's one rule for ordinary people when it comes to lockdown rules, but a completely other rule for top Tories. We also know, as well as the deaths from coronavirus, approaching 50,000, as I've said, thousands more have been struck long term with horrible after effects of the infection. And we know, talking about the absence of a government strategy, we know how they've given a completely damaging role to the private sector, because involving the private sector seems to be their top priority. So, for instance, the key role of test and trace has been given to private sector providers like Serco and Deloitte. Boris Johnson was saying a few months ago we were going to have a world-beating test and trace system. Who's ever heard of Serco running a world-beating anything? And they keep calling it NHS test and trace, but it's actually driven by the private sector. There's been a series of sleazy contracts for kit like personal protective equipment, no proper procurement, but contracts ending up in the hands of big Tory donors. There's been jobs for the boys and girls like Dido Harding, who's got no public health background whatsoever, but happens to be the wife of a Tory MP. The Tories have been more concerned about the interests of big business than the public's health throughout this pandemic. And of course, what people don't say, but they should say, one of the reasons that coronavirus has hit this country so hard is decades of underfunding of the NHS by coalition and Tory governments. People have died. Thousands of people have died because of coronavirus who didn't have to because of government sleaze, government obsession with the private sector and government incompetence. So we need a zero COVID strategy. And it's not about living with the virus, because who's going to live with the virus? People who live with the virus are the kinds of people that cannot work from home, who have to get on the bus and be care workers or bus drivers or work in hospitals. They're the people that will live with the virus. That's an exceptionally cruel characterisation. What we want is an aspiration to drive COVID down to zero. And we know it can be done. Richard talked about Pacific Rim countries like Japan, South Korea, and it's been done in New Zealand. I feel very strongly about this issue. I mean, there was a period when Hackney had some of the highest death rates in London, and I've been writing about it since the summer. I had a roundtable in July with members of the Government Scientific Advisory Group, Professor John Edmonds, Richard Horton of the Lancet, Dr. Joe Grady from the UCU, the College Lecturers Union, who's been very much the forefront, and said before universities and colleges went back that it would lead to a spike in infection, was ignored by the government, and sad to say ignored by my own front bench. And of course, when students went back to colleges and universities, you saw spikes in infection. We had Dame Donna Kinnear of the RCN and other stakeholders, and that was the roundtable earlier this month. And then this week, we had another event with independent it's the government's, it's not the government, it's an independent scientific advisory group. And they gave us a briefing on their 6-week emergency plan for lockdown, and they were led by Professor David King. We know we can do better. We know the failure to do better has meant thousands of people have lost their lives, and many more people in isolation and misery. How can it be that people in care homes at the end of their lives cannot meet with their close relatives? At best, they get to look at them through windows. At worst, they don't see them at all. We can do better. It's the government's incompetence, it's the government's callousness, it's the government's privileging the advantage of the private sector over systems that work. We can do better, we must do better, and we need a zero COVID strategy. Lives depend on it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Diane. And we're gonna think a little bit more about what you said. I think one thing that just struck me, Diane, with what you said, it's so emotive actually, that the collective suffering that we're having to endure because of this government strategy. I mean, you know, grandparents that might never have seen their grandchildren, people who have lost loved ones who haven't been able to hold the hands for that, you know, that last part of life. You know, these are huge pressures on people, and I won't forgive this government, you know, for you know, never mind all of the other things that we are ideologically opposed to. I will never forgive them for what they are making people endure throughout this crisis. And as you so eloquently put, at the same time, still very much committed to their own politics, you know, of privatization, of shifting resources from the public sector to the private sector ruthlessly, without proper public scrutiny, without there being an outrage, because we are all dealing with a pandemic. I'm going to go to some questions from the audience, if that's all right, people who have been watching at home. Somebody, and this is the age-old question, but if Diane Abbott doesn't know how to do this, then nobody else will. And I just want to ask you this, Diane. So we are not living through a COVID zero COVID strategy. I'm going to start with you. What do you think we can do to really get this message out there? So, you know, to the movement, like what can people, the hundreds of people that are watching now, what could they do to be part of this, Diane?
Well, I think it's a message we can get across as individuals, to our friends, to our family, within our union branch, if you're a Labour Party member or a member of any other party, frankly. I mean, I think we have to get the message across in whatever circles, whatever organisations you are individually, because the media is not going to push for zero COVID strategy. The media is not going to push for taking the private sector out of test and trace and giving it to public health and local authorities. So we have to raise the issue, campaign for the issues as individuals, and we have to take it forward because, as I say, lives depend on it.
And undoubtedly, I think there will be in the fullness of time, there'll be an inquiry actually into the government's handling of this, and no doubt the Conservative Party will try and reinvent themselves at the next general election, probably dropping Boris Johnson because he's been such an utter failure. And we can't allow them as a movement to do that. Corin, let me come to you. We've got about 10 minutes left of tonight's show. What are you going to be doing to try, like, where next for your campaign? Where, how are you ramping up this this strategy to let people know that there is a different way?
Yeah, so obviously we organised our first kind of official parent strike today, and that day of action was fantastic. We had, as I said, thousands of parents who were courageous and withdrew their children from school today in order to send a message. And I do really want to reiterate that wasn't an action that we took lightly, and it was not an action that we took against schools or head teachers or individual teachers. Our action is firmly aimed at the government and their failings in this crisis. And so going forward, what we've seen, particularly over this last weekend, given the announcement that we're going into the second national lockdown, is a huge surge of parents and carers and grandparents and school staff who are looking for support, they're looking for answers, and they're looking for strategies. And we're able to provide that for them. And so we are going to be ramping up kind of spreading the word, but there will also be further actions from us in forms of further strikes and pushing the government in terms of our petitioning, letter writing. All of our actions are virtual, done online, because it's not safe for us to meet, obviously, at the moment.
Can I ask, somebody's asked, Jennifer's asked, how can parents get help if they're threatened with fines? Is that something your group can help with?
Yeah, definitely. So we have associated with our campaign a wonderful human rights barrister, Mark MacDonald, who is providing his time completely free of charge to any parent who has been threatened with a fine or is being taken to court. Mark will, and I don't think he'll mind me saying this, we said it this morning, Mark will, for free, represent any parent who is taken to court. So if you are facing fines, facing prosecution, then obviously get in touch with us at Brutus Parents United. That's on Facebook, or you can find us on our website, which is www.boycottunsafeschools.co.uk, and on Twitter we are parents_united, and we'll be able to put you in touch with Mark if that's the avenue that you need to go down.
Amazing, because I mean, imagine how cruel is it to be fining people in a global pandemic when, not only that people are losing their jobs, but it's just such an agonizing decision.
And
anyway,
can I just
Gwen, of course.
Laura, sorry, one of the things that we did as a campaign is that we championed a petition that went through the official parliamentary petition site, and it was actually debated on Monday, I think it was, to revoke the threat of fines, and that was debated, and the conclusion still was that those fines and those threat of fines and criminal prosecution for parents during a global pandemic is going to stand. That is the government that we're working with here, that they think the best way to protect our families and protect our children is to threaten them with fines and criminality.
it is just disgusting. Gawain, can I come to you and ask really what next for the National Education Union? After this, we just have time for one more question to everyone, but what next for the strategy? I know you've got this app. Do you think it could lead to disputes and industrial action in schools, or?
So for us, the next step is going to be that collective building in our workplaces, because we know that the strength of any union comes from not just listening to its members, but being its members. Members at all levels, we know, are supporting us on this. We think that educators, school leaders, parents, the vast majority are all on the same page. What they want is this virus defeated and our schools and colleges safe. So we want to work together to that end. The app's been released because what it allows is it allows school groups to come together in this digital age, to come together at a distance or online, to organise around the issues that are causing the biggest problems in their workplace, the vast majority of which at the moment are COVID related, and then to build a collective response to that. And we know that by strengthening every workplace, by organising collectively in every community, what we're doing is building the power that can change government policy. And as I said earlier, if we can't change government policy, we need to change the government.
Absolutely right. I think that, by the way, there's so many supportive comments for all of the people that have spoken tonight. People are virtually whooping and cheering if we can't hear them, at least. Okay, I'm just going to ask you this. It's a bit harsh, but I'm just going to do it anyway. I just want to know from each of you, if you just had like 3 priorities, just 3 that you needed to name about what needs to change from this point onwards, what would those 3 things be? And I'm coming to you, Corbyn, first. Is that a harsh thing to do? I
knew you were going to do that.
You'll be coming from your campaign's perspective. You live and breathe it, but what are the 3 priorities? And you don't need to embellish on them all, just bam, hit us with 3 priorities.
Okay, well, I think that our 3 priorities are the things that I mentioned earlier. We need to see a properly funded, comprehensively funded and resourced, blended and remote learning programme. And that means laptops, it means food for children, and it means access to the internet. And we need to see reduced class sizes, however that is done, whether it's done via the NEU's suggestion of a rota system, but we need to see those reduced class sizes for social distancing. And we need to see the end of fining and criminal prosecutions for parents who are not sending their children to school.
Amazing. Sorry, this is like the dystopian version of Desert Island Discs, isn't it? Where you're allowed to like take 3 things to an island. But Gawain, 3 priorities for the National Education Union.
3 things we need to say now. First of all, schools and colleges should be included in this lockdown, otherwise it's not a lockdown. Secondly, as Corbyn has just said, we need that massive investment, whether it's rotas initially, but ultimately for Nightingale schools and colleges, an investment in expanding the education workforce to bring class sizes right down and make our schools and colleges safe so they can continue to operate. And third of all, and I think this is most important going forward, government needs to learn to listen to parents, to the profession, to the people of this country.
Thank you so much. And Diane, have you got any closing comments, any 3 of the most important political priorities for you right now in this crisis?
Well, first of all, we need to take test and trace out of the hands of the private sector and give it to local authorities and directors of public health to run. Secondly, we need to look at the whole issue of sick pay and levels of sick pay and the reach of sick pay. It's no good saying that people should self-isolate if they've got the infection, if they can't afford not to work. I mean, it's been a problem. People going to work because they simply can't afford to stay at home. And I think we do have to look at schools, as Corinne and Gawain have said. But I also think we need to put things in place that make sure that children who may already have an achievement gap, the achievement gap doesn't widen. And I think Corinne was talking about laptops, access to broadband, and so on.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you so much to all of the contributors tonight. It is clear there is a completely different way that things can proceed. It's been articulated so well by every single one of our commentators. Thank you so much to John Rees, to Richard Bergen, to Corin Pearson, to Gawain Little, to Diane Abbott. You have been well, you've perked me up, I have to say, because it is hard, isn't it? It's hard day in, day out thinking about this crisis, thinking about the way through. I wonder what I did before this crisis, because I only think about this now, and that is hard. It's tiring, and I know I can feel a collective tiredness in the movement, and people are battling on through this, and you have been amazing. We need to keep going. We need to keep the faith that things can be different. Somebody asked about how do we handle, I'm just looking at your question now, how do we handle the anti-maskers? Well, we had a whole People's Assembly meeting on deconstructing the conspiracy theories and the fake news. Please go back and watch that. I think it's about 3 weeks back now. But we know it's real. We know that this is hitting the poorest the hardest. We know, as Diane has repeatedly said, is entrenching those inequalities where the gaps existed, they're widened, and it is incumbent upon all of us that we are part of that fight back. And we think that the most succinct way to describe that, the most succinct strategy, which includes all of the things that have been discussed today about a proper lockdown, proper provision for people who need to self-isolate, not fines and punishment, but financial support, practical support and guidance to allow people to shield themselves away from the virus, to suppress it, and fundamentally, as Diane reiterated to us very clearly, that the test, trace and isolate system needs to be put into public hands and away from the private sector, and so much more. Read our COVID charter, please support that COVID charter, the Zero COVID charter, and make sure that people know what it means. Pop it on your Facebook post, and once again, share this live meeting tonight. Thank you very much. We'll be back on Thursday with another theme, with a different presenter probably, but enjoy the rest of your week if you can. Keep safe, and let's support each other through this second lockdown. Thank